Welcome, the Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. Comment below if you like. If you have authors that you'd like to see recognized, list them in the comments or contact our author page. Subscribe for more tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten. We'll have quite a collection climbing out of the tombs. If you like any of our tales, comment, ring the bell, and crush the like button below. Unknown Horror Masters. The Skull and Bones collection has risen from the grave. More beasts to be released soon. Find us on Fiverr to raise 7 kinds of hell. Check out our other stories and our websites. YouTube, BitChute, Rumble, Dweller of the Dark. Official website, dwellerofthedark.com. Kindle Vella, new serialized novels and novelette. Weekly new episodes. Check out links below for Where the Wolf Dwells. The Curious Death of Dionysus Shall Not. Our books and ebooks are on Kindle Amazon. Follow, support us on Twitter, Instagram, Patreon, Bandcamp. Dweller of the Dark. Children of Horror. Legion of Ghouls. Tonight, we continue our celebration of Halloween. Each night, we will be presenting tales of the best Halloween horrors ever conjured to terrify, haunt, and delight. The Graveyard Rats by Henry Kuttner. Old Masson, the caretaker of one of Salem's oldest and most neglected cemeteries, had a feud with the rats. Generations ago, they had come up from the wharves and settled in the graveyard, a colony of abnormally large rats. And when Masson had taken charge after the inexplicable disappearance of the former caretaker, he decided that they must go. At first, he set traps for them and put poisoned food by their burrows. And later he tried to shoot them, but it did no good. The rats stayed, multiplying and overrunning the graveyard with their ravenous hordes. They were large, even for the mus decumanus, which sometimes measures 15 inches in length, exclusive of the naked pink and gray tail. Masson had caught glimpses of some as large as good-sized cats, and when once or twice the grave diggers had uncovered their burrows, the malodorous tunnels were large enough to enable a man to crawl into them on his hands and knees. The ships that had come generations ago from distant ports to the rotting Salem wharves had brought strange cargoes. Masson wondered sometimes at the extraordinary size of these burrows. He recalled certain vaguely disturbing legends he had heard since coming to ancient, witch-haunted Salem, tales of moribund, inhuman life that was said to exist in forgotten burrows in the earth. The old days, when Cotton Mather had hunted down the evil cults that worshipped Hecate and the dark Magna Mater, and frightful orgies had passed. But dark gabled houses still lean perilously towards each other over narrow, cobbled streets, and blasphemous secrets and mysteries were said to be hidden in subterranean cellars and caverns, where forgotten pagan rites were still celebrated in defiance of law and sanity. Wagging their gray heads wisely, the elders declared that there were worse things than rats and maggots crawling in the unhallowed earth of the ancient Salem cemeteries. And then, too, there was this curious dread of the rats.
Masson disliked and respected the ferocious little rodents, for he knew the danger that lurked in their flashing, needle-sharp fangs. But he could not understand the inexplicable horror which the oldsters held for deserted, rat-infested houses. He had heard vague rumors of ghoulish beings that dwelt far underground and that had the power of commanding the rats, marshaling them like horrible armies. The rats, the old man whispered, were messengers between this world and the grim and ancient caverns far below Salem. Bodies had been stolen from graves for nocturnal subterranean feasts, they said. The myth of the Pied Piper is a fable that hides a blasphemous horror, and the black pits of Avernus have brought forth hell-spawn monstrosities that never venture into the light of day. Masson paid little attention to these tales. He did not fraternize with his neighbors and, in fact, did all he could to hide the existence of the rats from intruders. Investigation, he realized, would undoubtedly mean the opening of many graves, and while some of the gnawed, empty coffins could be attributed to the activities of the rats, Masson might find it difficult to explain the mutilated bodies that lay in some of the coffins. The purest gold is used in filling teeth, and this gold is not removed when a man is buried. Clothing, of course, is another matter, for usually the undertaker provides a plain, broadcloth suit that is cheap and easily recognizable. But gold is another matter, and sometimes, too, there were medical students and less reputable doctors who were in need of cadavers and not over scrupulous as to where these were obtained. So far, Masson had successfully managed to discourage investigation. He had fiercely denied the existence of the rats, even though they sometimes robbed him of his prey. Masson did not care what happened to the bodies after he had performed his gruesome thefts, but the rats inevitably dragged away the whole cadaver through the hole they gnawed in the coffin. The size of these burrows occasionally worried Masson. Then, too, there was the curious circumstance of the coffins always being gnawed open at the end, never at the side or top. It was almost as though the rats were working under the direction of some impossibly intelligent leader. Now he stood in an open grave and threw a last sprinkling of wet earth on the heap beside the pit. It was raining, a slow, cold drizzle that for weeks had been descending from soggy black clouds. The graveyard was a slough of yellow, sucking mud from which the rain-washed tombstones stood up in irregular battalions. The rats had retreated to their burrows, and Masson had not seen one for days. But his gaunt, unshaved face was set in frowning lines. The coffin on which he was standing was a wooden one. The body had been buried several days earlier, but Masson had not dared to disinter it before. A relative of the dead man had been coming to the grave at intervals, even in the drenching rain. But he would hardly come at this late hour, no matter how much grief he might be suffering, Masson thought, grinning wryly. He straightened and laid the shovel aside. From the hill on which the ancient graveyard lay, he could see the lights of Salem flickering dimly through the downpour. He drew a flashlight from his pocket. He would need light now. Taking up the spade, he bent and examined the fastenings of the coffin. Abruptly, he stiffened. Beneath his feet, he sensed an unquiet stirring and scratching, as though something were moving within the coffin. For a moment, a pang of superstitious fear shot through Masson, and then rage replaced it as he realized the significance of the sound. The rats had forestalled him again. In a paroxysm of anger, Masson wrenched at the fastenings of the coffin. He got the sharp edge of the shovel underneath the lid and pried it up until he could finish the job with his hands. Then he set the flashlight's cold beam darting down into the coffin. Rain spattered against the white satin lining. The coffin was empty. Masson saw a flicker of movement at the head of the case and darted the light in that direction. The end of the sarcophagus had been gnawed through, and a gaping hole led into darkness. A black shoe, limp and dragging, was disappearing as Masson watched, and abruptly he realized that the rats had forestalled him by only a few minutes. He fell on his hands and knees and made a hasty clutch at the shoe, and the flashlight incontinently fell into the coffin and went out. The shoe was tugged from his grasp. He heard a sharp, excited squealing, and then he had the flashlight again and was darting its light into the burrow. It was a large one. It had to be, or the corpse could not have been dragged along it. Masson wondered at the size of the rats that could carry away a man's body. But the thought of the loaded revolver in his pocket fortified him. Probably if this corpse had been an ordinary one, Masson would have left the rats with their spoils rather than venture into the narrow burrow. But he remembered an especially fine set of cufflinks he had observed, as well as a stick pin that was undoubtedly a genuine pearl. Scarcely a pause, he clipped the flashlight to his belt and crept into the burrow. It was a tight fit, but he managed to squeeze himself along. Ahead of him, in the flashlight's glow, he could see the shoes dragging along the wet earth of the bottom of the tunnel. He crept along the burrows as rapidly as he could, occasionally barely able to squeeze his lean body through the narrow walls. The air was overpowering with its musty stench of carrion. If he could not reach the corpse in a minute, Masson decided he would turn back. Belated fears were beginning to crawl, maggot-like, within his mind, but greed urged him on. He crawled forward, several times passing the miles of adjoining tunnels. The walls of the burrow were damp and slimy, and twice, lumps of dirt dropped behind him. The second time, he paused and screwed his head around to look back. He could see nothing, of course, until he had unhooked the flashlight from his belt and reversed it. Several clods lay on the ground behind him, and the danger of his position suddenly became real and terrifying. With thoughts of a cave-in making his pulse race, he decided to abandon the pursuit, even though he had almost overtaken the corpse and the invisible things that pulled it. But he had overlooked one thing. The burrow was too narrow to allow him to turn. Panic touched him briefly, but he remembered a side tunnel he had just passed and backed awkwardly along the tunnel until he came to it. He thrust his legs into it, backing until he found himself able to turn. Then he hurriedly began to retrace his way, although his knees were bruised and painful. Agonizing pain shot through his leg. He felt sharp teeth sink into his flesh and kicked out frantically. There was a shrill squealing and the scurry of many feet. Flashing the light behind him, Masson caught his breath in a sob of fear as he saw a dozen great rats watching him intently, their slitted eyes glittering in the light. They were great, misshapen things, as large as cats, and behind them he caught a glimpse of a dark shape that stirred and moved swiftly aside into the shadow, and he shuddered at the unbelievable size of the thing. The light had held them for a moment, but they were edging closer, their teeth dull orange in the pale light. Masson tugged at his pistol, managed to extricate it from his pocket and aimed carefully. It was an awkward position, and he tried to press his feet into the soggy sides of the burrows so that he should not inadvertently send a bullet into one of them. The rolling thunder of the shot deafened him for a time, and the clouds of smoke set him coughing. When he could hear again and the smoke had cleared, he saw the rats were gone. He put the pistol back and began to creep swiftly along the tunnel, and then, with a scurry and a rush, they were upon him again. They swarmed over his legs, biting and squealing insanely, and Masson shrieked horribly as he snatched for his gun. He fired without aiming, and only luck saved him from blowing a foot off. This time the rats did not retreat so far, but Masson was crawling as swiftly as he could along the burrow, ready to fire again at the first sound of another attack. There was a patter of feet, and he sent the light stabbing behind him. A great gray rat paused and watched him. Its long, ragged whiskers twitched, and its scabrous, naked tail was moving slowly from side to side. Masson shouted, and the rat retreated. He crawled on, pausing briefly. The black gap of a side tunnel at his elbow, as he made out a shapeless huddle on the damp clay a few yards ahead. For a second, he thought it was a mass of earth that had been dislodged from the roof. And then he recognized it as a human body. It was a brown and shriveled mummy. And with a dreadful, unbelieving shock, Masson realized that it was moving. It was crawling towards him, and in the pale glow of the flashlight, the man saw a frightful, gargoyle face thrust into his own. It was the passionless, death's head skull of a long-dead corpse, instinct with hellish life, and the glazed eyes, swollen and bulbous, betrayed the thing's blindness. It made a faint groaning sound as it crawled towards Masson, stretched its ragged and granulated lips in a grin of dreadful hunger, and Masson was frozen with abysmal fear and loathing. Just before the horror touched him, Masson flung himself frantically into the burrow at his side. He heard a scrambling noise at his heels, and the thing groaned dully as it came after him. Masson, glancing over his shoulder, screamed and propelled himself desperately through the narrow burrow. He crawled along awkwardly, sharp stones cutting his hands and knees. Dirt showered into his eyes, but he dared not pause even for a moment. He scrambled on, gasping, cursing, and praying hysterically. Squealing triumphantly, the rats came at him, horrible hunger in their eyes. Masson almost succumbed to their vicious teeth before he succeeded in beating them off. The passage was narrowing, and in a frenzy of terror, he kicked and screamed and fired until the hammer clicked on an empty shell. But he had driven them off. He found himself crawling under a great stone embedded in the roof that dug cruelly into his back. It moved a little as his weight struck it, and an idea flashed into Masson's fright-crazed mind. If he could bring down the stone so that it blocked the tunnel. The earth was wet and soggy from the rains. and he hunched himself half upright and dug away at the dirt around the stone. The rats were coming closer. He saw their eyes glowing in the reflection of the flashlight's beam. Still he clawed frantically at the earth. The stone was giving. He tugged at it, and it rocked in its foundation. A rat was approaching, the monster he had already glimpsed. Gray and leprous and hideous, it crept forward with its orange teeth bared, and in its wake came the blind dead thing, groaning as it crawled. Masson gave a last frantic tug at the stone. He felt it slide downwards, and then he went scrambling along the tunnel. Behind him, the stone crashed down, and he heard a sudden, frightful shriek of agony. Clods showered upon his legs. A heavy weight fell on his feet, and he dragged him free with difficulty. The entire tunnel was collapsing. Gasping with fear, Masson threw himself forward as the soggy earth collapsed at his heels. The tunnel narrowed until he could barely use his hands and legs to propel himself. He wriggled forward like an eel, suddenly felt satin tearing beneath his clawing fingers, and then his head crashed against something that barred his path. He moved his legs, discovering that they were not pinned under the collapsed earth. He was lying flat on his stomach, and when he tried to raise himself, he found that the roof was only a few inches from his back. Panic shot through him. When the blind horror had blocked his path, he had flung himself desperately into a side tunnel, a tunnel that had no outlet. He was in a coffin, an empty coffin, into which he had crept through the hole the rats had gnawed in its end. He tried to turn on his back and found that he could not. The lid of the coffin pinned him down inexorably. Then he braced himself and strained at the coffin lid. It was immovable. And even if he could escape from the sarcophagus, how could he claw his way up through 5 feet of hard-packed earth? He found himself gasping. It was dreadfully fetid, unbearably hot. In a paroxysm of terror, he ripped and clawed at the satin until it was shredded. He made a futile attempt to dig with his feet at the earth from the collapsed burrow that blocked his retreat. If he were only able to reverse his position, he might be able to claw his way through to air. Air. White-hot agony lanced through his breast, throbbed in his eyeballs. His head seemed to be swelling, growing larger and larger. And suddenly, he heard the exultant squealing of the rats. He began to scream insanely, but could not drown them out. For a moment, he thrashed about hysterically within his narrow prison, and then he was quiet, gasping for air. His eyelids closed. His blackened tongue protruded, and he sank down into the blackness of death with the mad squealing of the rats dinning in his ears.
The Black Kiss by Robert Bloch and Henry Kuttner. They rise in green robes, roaring from the green hells of the sea, where fallen skies and evil hues and eyeless creatures be. Chesterton, Lepanto. 1. The Thing in the Waters.
Graham Dean nervously crushed out his cigarette and met Dr. Hedwig's puzzled eyes. "I've never been troubled like this before," he said. "These dreams are so oddly persistent. They're not the usual haphazard nightmares. They seem, I know it sounds ridiculous, they seem planned." "Dreams planned? Nonsense." Dr. Hedwig looked scornful. "You, Mr. Dean, are an artist and naturally of impressionable temperament. This house at San Pedro is new to you, and you say you've heard wild tales. The dreams are due to imagination and overwork." Dean glanced out of the window, a frown of his unnaturally pale face. "I hope you're right," he said softly. "But dreams shouldn't make me look like this, should they?" A gesture indicated the great blue rings beneath the young artist's eyes. His hands indicated the bloodless pallor of his gaunt cheeks. "Overwork has done that, Mr. Dean. I know what has happened to you better than you do yourself." The white-haired physician picked up a sheet covered with his own scarcely decipherable notes and scrutinized it in review. "You inherited this house at San Pedro a few months ago, eh? And you moved in alone to do some work." "Yes. The seacoast there has some marvelous scenes." For a moment, Dean's face looked youthful once more as enthusiasm kindled its ashy fires. Then he continued with a troubled frown. "But I haven't been able to paint lately. Not seascapes, anyway. It's very odd. My sketches don't seem quite right anymore. There seems to be a quality in them that I don't put there." "A quality, did you say?" "Yes, a quality of malignness. If I call it that, it's indefinable. Something behind the picture takes all the beauty out. And I haven't been overworking these last weeks, Dr. Hedwig." The doctor glanced again at the paper in his hand. "Well, I disagree with you there. You might be unconscious of the effort you expend. These dreams of the sea that seem to worry you are meaningless, save as an indication of your nervous condition." "You're wrong!" Dean rose suddenly. His voice was shrill. "That's the dreadful part of it. The dreams are not meaningless. They seem cumulative and planned. Each night they grow more vivid, and I see more of that green, shining place under the sea. I get closer and closer to those black shadows swimming there. Those shadows that I know aren't shadows, but something worse. I see more each night. It's like a sketch I'd block out, gradually adding more and more until..." Hedwig watched his patient keenly. He suggested, "Until?" But Dean's tense face relaxed. He had caught himself just in time. "No, Dr. Hedwig, you must be right. It's overwork and nervousness, as you say. If I believed what the Mexicans had told me about Morella Godolfo, well, I'd be mad and a fool." "Who is this Morella Godolfo? Some woman who has been filling you with foolish tales?" Dean smiled. "No need to worry about Morella. She was my great-great-grandaunt. She used to live in the San Pedro house and started the legends, I think." Hedwig had been scribbling on a slip of paper. "Well, I see, young man. You heard these legends. Your imagination ran riot.
You dreamed. This prescription will fix you up. Thanks. Dean took the paper, lifted his hat from the table, and started for the door. In the doorway, he paused, smiling wryly. But you're not quite correct in thinking the legend started me dreaming, Doctor. I began to dream before I learned the history of the house. And with that, he went out. Driving back to San Pedro, Dean tried to understand what had happened to him. But always, he came up against a blank wall of impossibility. Any logical explanation wandered off into a tangle of fantasy. The one thing he could not explain, which Dr. Hedwig had not been able to explain, was the dreams. The dreams started soon after he came into his legacy, this ancient house north of San Pedro, which had so long stood deserted. The place was picturesquely old, and that attracted Dean from the first. It had been built by one of his ancestors when the Spaniards still ruled California. One of the deans, the name was Dina, then, had gone to Spain and returned with a bride. Her name was Morella Godolfo, and it was this long-vanished woman about whom all the subsequent legends centered. Even yet, there were wrinkled, toothless Mexicans in San Pedro who whispered incredible tales of Morella Godolfo, she who had never grown old and who had a weirdly evil power over the sea. The Godolfos had been among the proudest families of Granada, but furtive legends spoke of their intercourse with the terrible Moorish sorcerers and necromancers. Morella, according to these same hinted horrors, had learned uncanny secrets in the Black Towers of Moorish Spain, and when Dina had brought her as his bride across the sea, she had already sealed a pact with dark powers and had undergone a change. So ran the tales, and they further told of Morella's life in the old San Pedro house. Her husband had lived for 10 years or more after the marriage, but rumors said that he no longer possessed a soul. It is certain that his death was very mysteriously hushed up by Morella Godolfo, who went on living alone in the great house beside the sea. The whispers of the peons were hereafter monstrously augmented. They had to do with the change in Morella Godolfo, the sorceress change, which caused her to swim far out to sea on moonlit nights, so that watchers saw her white body gleaming amidst the spray. Men bold enough to gaze from the cliffs might catch glimpses of her then, sporting with queer sea creatures that gamboled about her in the black waters, nuzzling her with shockingly deformed heads. These creatures were not seals or any known form of submarine life. It was averred, although sometimes bursts of chuckling, gobbling laughter could be heard. It is said that Morella Godolfo had swum out there one night, and that she never came back. But thereafter the laughter was louder from afar, and the sporting amidst the black rocks continued, so that the tales of the early peons had been nourished down to the present day. Such were the legends known to Dean. The facts were sparse and inconclusive. The old house had fallen into decrepitude and was only occasionally rented through the years. These rentals had been as short as they were infrequent. There was nothing definitely wrong with the house between White's Point and Point Furman, but those who had lived there said that the crashing of the surf sounded subtly different when heard through windows that overlooked the sea. And 2, they dreamed unpleasantly. Sometimes the occasional tenants had mentioned with peculiar horror the moonlit nights when the sea became altogether too clearly visible. At any rate, occupants often vacated the house hastily. Dean had moved in immediately after inheriting because he had thought the place ideal for painting the scenes he loved. He had learned the legend and the facts behind it later, and by this time his dreams had started. At first, they had been conventional enough, though oddly all centered about the sea, which he so loved. But it was not the sea he loved that he knew in sleep. The Gorgons lived in his dreams. Scylla writhed hideously across dark and surging waters, where harpies flew, screaming. Weird creatures crawled sluggishly up from the black, inky depths, where eyeless, bloated sea beasts dwelt. Gigantic and terrible leviathans leapt and plunged, while monstrous serpents squirmed a strange obeisance to a mocking moon. Foul and hidden horrors of the sea's depths engulfed him in sleep. This was bad enough, but it was only a prelude. The dreams began to change. It was almost as though the first few formed a definite setting for the greater terrors to come. From the mythic images of old sea gods, another vision emerged. It was inchoate at first, taking definite form and meaning very slowly over a period of several weeks. And it was this dream which Dean now feared. It had occurred generally just before he awoke. A vision of green, translucent light in which dark shadows swam slowly. Night after night, the limpid emerald glow grew brighter, and the shadows twisted into a more visible horror. These were never clearly seen, although their amorphous heads held a strangely repellent, recognizable quality for Dean. Presently, in this dream of his, the shadow creatures would move aside as though to permit the passage of another. Swimming into the green haze would come a coiling shape. Whether similar to the rest or not, Dean could not tell, for his dream always ended there. The approach of this last shape always caused him to awake in a nightmare paroxysm of terror. He dreamt of being somewhere under the sea, amidst swimming shadows with deformed heads. And each night, one particular shadow was coming closer and closer. Each day now, when he awoke, with the cold sea wind of early dawn blowing through the windows, he would lie in a lazy, languid mood till long past daybreak. When he rose these days, he felt inexplicably tired, and he could not paint. This particular morning, the sight of his haggard face in the mirror had forced him to visit a physician, but Dr. Hedwig had not been helpful. Nevertheless, Dean filled the prescription on the way home. A swallow of the bitter, brownish tonic strengthened him somewhat, but as he parked his car, the feeling of depression settled down on him again. He walked up to the house still puzzled and strangely afraid. Under the door was a telegram. Dean read it with a puzzled frown. Just learned you are living in San Pedro House. Stop. Vitally important. You vacate immediately. Stop. Show this cable to Dr. Makoto Yamada, 17 Bueno Street, San Pedro, stop. Am returning via airplane, stop. See Yamada today. Michael Lay. Dean read the message again, and a flash of remembrance came to him. Michael Lay was his uncle, but he had not seen the man for years. Lay had been a puzzle to the family. He was an occultist and spent most of his time delving in far corners of the earth. Occasionally, he dropped from sight for long periods of time. The cable Dean held was sent from Calcutta, and he supposed that Lay had recently emerged from some spot in the interior of India to learn of Dean's inheritance. Dean searched his mind. He recalled now that there had been some family quarrel about this very house years ago. The details were no longer clear, but he remembered that Lay had demanded the San Pedro house be razed. Lay had given no sane reasons, and when the request was refused, he had dropped out of sight for a time. And now came this inexplicable cablegram. Dean was tired from his long drive, and the unsatisfactory interview with the doctor had irritated him more than he had realized. Nor was he in the mood to follow his uncle's cabled request and undertake the long journey to Buena Street, which was miles away. The drowsiness which he felt, however, was normal, healthy exhaustion, unlike the languor of recent weeks. The tonic he had taken was of some value, after all. He dropped into his favorite chair by the window that overlooked the sea, rousing himself to watch the flaming colors of the sunset. Presently the sun dropped below the horizon, and gray dusk crept in. Stars appeared, and far to the north he could see the dim lights of the gambling ships off Venice. The mountains shut off his view of San Pedro, but a diffused pale glow in that direction told him that the New Barbary was wakening into roaring, brawling life. Slowly, the face of the Pacific brightened. A full moon was rising above the San Pedro hills. For a long time, Dean sat quietly by the window, his pipe forgotten in his hand, staring down at the slow swells of the ocean, which seemed to pulse with a mighty and alien life. Gradually, drowsiness crept up and overwhelmed him. Just before he dropped into the abyss of sleep, there flashed into his mind Da Vinci's saying, "The two most wonderful things in the world are a woman's smile and the motion of mighty waters." He dreamed, and this time it was a different dream. At first, only blackness and a roaring and thundering as of angry seas, and oddly mingled with this was the hazy thought of a woman's smile and a woman's lips, pouting lips, softly alluring. But strangely, the lips were not red. No! They were very pale, bloodless, like the lips of a thing that had long rested beneath the sea. The misty vision changed, and for a flashing instant, Dean seemed to see the green and silent place of his earlier visions. The shadowy black shapes were moving more quickly behind the veil, but this picture was of but a second's duration. It flashed out and vanished, and Dean was standing alone on a beach he recognized in his dream, the sandy cove beneath the house.
The salt breeze blew coldly across his face, and the sea glistened like silver in the moonlight. A faint splash told of a sea thing that broke the surface of the waters. To the north, the sea washed against the rugged surface of the cliff, barred and speckled with black shadows. Dean felt a sudden, inexplicable impulse to move in that direction. He yielded. As he clambered over the rocks, he was suddenly conscious of a strange sensation, as though keen eyes were focused upon him, eyes that watched and warned. Vaguely in his mind rose up the gaunt face of his uncle, Michael Lay, the deep-set eyes glowing. But swiftly this was gone, and he found himself before a deeper niche of blackness in the cliff face. Into it he knew he must go. He squeezed himself between two jutting points of rock and found himself in utter, dismal darkness. Yet somehow he was conscious that he was in a cave, and he could hear water lapping nearby. All about him was a musty salt odor of sea decay, the fetid smell of sunless ocean caves and holds of ancient ships. He stepped forward and, as the floor shelved sharply downward, stumbled and fell headlong into icy, shallow water. He felt, rather than saw, a flicker of swift movement, and then abruptly, hot lips were pressed against his. Human lips, Dean thought at first. He lay on his side in the chill water, his lips against those responsive ones. He could see nothing, for all was lost in the blackness of the cave. The unearthly lure of those invisible lips thrilled through him. He responded to them, pressed them fiercely, gave them what they were avidly seeking. The unseen waters crawled against the rocks, whispering warning. And in that kiss, strangeness flooded him. He felt a shock and a tingling go through him, and then a thrill of sudden ecstasy, and swift on its heels came horror. Black, loathsome foulness seemed to wash his brain, indescribable but fearfully real, making him shudder with nausea. It was as though unutterable evil were pouring into his body, his mind, his very soul, through the blasphemous kiss on his lips. He felt loathsome, contaminated. He fell back. He sprang to his feet. And Dean saw, for the first time, the ghastly thing he had kissed, as the sinking moon sent a pale shaft of radiance creeping through the cave mouth. For something rose up before him, a serpentine and seal-like bulk that coiled and twisted and moved toward him, glistening with foul slime. And Dean screamed and turned to flee, with nightmare fear tearing at his brain, hearing behind him a quiet splashing, as though some bulky creature had slid back into the water. 2. A visit from Dr. Yamada. He awoke. He was still in his chair before the window, and the moon was paling before the grayness of dawn. He was shaken with nausea, sick and shuddering with the shocking realism of his dream. His clothing was drenched with perspiration, and his heart hammered furiously. An immense lethargy seemed to have overwhelmed him, making it an intense effort to rise from the chair and stagger to a couch, on which he flung himself to doze fitfully for several hours. A sharp pealing of the doorbell
roused him. He still felt weak and dizzy, but the frightening lethargy had somewhat abated when Dean opened the door. A Japanese standing on the porch began a bobbing little bow, a gesture that was abruptly arrested as the sharp black eyes focused on Dean's face. A little hiss of indrawn breath came from the visitor. Dean said irritably, "Well, do you want to see me?" The other was still staring, his thin face sallow beneath the stiff thatch of gray hair. He was a small, slender man, with his face covered with a fine spun web of wrinkles. After a pause, he said, "I am Dr. Yamada." Dean frowned, puzzled. Abruptly, he remembered his uncle's cable of the day before. An odd, unreasonable irritation began to mount within him, and he said, more brusquely than he had intended, "This isn't a professional call, I hope. I've already—" "Your uncle, you are Mr. Dean, cabled me. He was rather worried." Dr. Yamada glanced around almost furtively. Dean felt distaste stir within him, and his irritation increased. "My uncle is rather eccentric, I'm afraid. There's nothing for him to worry about. I'm sorry you had your trip for nothing." Dr. Yamada did not seem to take offense at Dean's attitude. Rather, a strange expression of sympathy showed for a moment on his small face. "Do you mind if I come in?" he asked, and moved forward confidently. Short of barring his way, Dean had no means of stopping him, and ungraciously led his guest to the room where he had spent the night, motioning him to a chair while he busied himself with a coffee pot. Yamada sat motionless, silently watching Dean. Then, without preamble, he said, "Your uncle is a great man, Mr. Dean." Dean made a non-committal gesture. "I have seen him only once." "He is one of the greatest occultists of this day. I, too, have studied psychic lore, but beside your uncle, I am a novice," Dean said. "He is eccentric. Occultism, as you term it, has never interested me." The little Japanese watched him impassively. "You make a common error, Mr. Dean. You consider occultism a hobby for cranks. No." He held up a slender hand. "Your disbelief is written in your face. Well, it is understandable. It is an anachronism, an attitude handed down from the earliest times, when scientists were called alchemists and sorcerers and burned for making pacts with the devil. But actually, there are no sorcerers, no witches. Not in the sense that man understands these terms. There are men and women who have acquired mastery over certain sciences, which are not wholly subject to mundane physical laws." There was a little smile of disbelief on Dean's face. Yamada went on quietly. "You do not believe because you do not understand. There are not many who can comprehend or wish to comprehend this greater science, which is not bound by earthly laws. But here is a problem for you, Mr. Dean." A little spark of irony flickered in the black eyes. "Can you tell me how I know you have suffered from nightmares recently?" Dean jerked around and stood staring. Then he smiled. "As it happens, I know the answer, Dr. Yamada. You physicians have a way of hanging together, and I must have let something slip to Dr. Hedwig yesterday." His tone was offensive, but Yamada merely shrugged slightly. "Do you know
You're Homer? He asked, apparently irrelevantly, and at Dean's surprised nod, went on.
And Proteus? You remember the old man of the sea who possessed the power of changing his shape? I do not wish to strain your credulity, Mr. Dean, but for a long time, students of the dark lore have known that behind this legend there exists a very terrible truth. All the tales of spirit possession, of reincarnation, even the comparatively innocuous experiments in thought transference point to the truth. Why do you suppose folklore abounds with tales of men who have been able to change themselves into beasts, werewolves, hyenas, tigers, the sealmen of the Eskimos? Because these tales are founded on truth. I do not mean, he went on, that the actual physical metamorphosis of the body is possible so far as we know, but it has long been known that the intelligence, the mind of an adept can be transferred to the brain and body of a satisfactory subject. Animals' brains are weak, lacking the power of resistance, but men are different unless there are certain circumstances.
As he hesitated, Dean proffered the Japanese a cup of coffee. Coffee was generally brewing in the percolator these days, and Yamada accepted it with a formal little bow of acknowledgement. Dean drank his coffee in 3 hasty gulps and poured more. Yamada, after a polite sip, put the cup aside and leaned forward earnestly.
I must ask you to make your mind receptive, Mr. Dean. Don't allow your conventional ideas of life to influence you in this matter. It is vitally to your interest that you listen carefully to me and understand. Then, perhaps.
He hesitated and again threw that oddly furtive glance at the window.
Life in the sea has followed different lines from life on land. Evolution has followed a different course. In the great deeps of the ocean, life utterly alien to ours has been discovered. Luminous creatures which burst when exposed to the lighter pressure of the air. And in those tremendous depths, forms of life completely inhuman have been developed. Life forms that the uninitiated mind may think impossible. In Japan, an island country, we have known of these sea dwellers for generations. Your English writer, author Masson, has told a deep truth in his statement that man, afraid of these strange beings, has attributed to them beautiful or pleasantly grotesque forms which in reality they do not possess. Thus we have the Nereids and Oceanids, but nevertheless man could not fully disguise the true foulness of these creatures. Therefore, there are legends of the Gorgons, of Scylla, and the Harpies, and, significantly, of the mermaids and their soullessness. No doubt, you know the mermaid tale, how they long to steal the soul of a man and draw it out by means of their kiss.
Dean was at the window now, his back to the Japanese. As Yamada paused, he said tonelessly, "Go on."
I have reason to believe,
Yamada went on very quietly,
that Morella Rodolfo, the woman from Alhambra, was not fully human. She left no issue. These things never have children. They cannot.
What do you mean? Dean had turned and was facing the Japanese, his face a ghastly white, the shadows beneath his eyes hideously livid. He repeated harshly, "What do you mean?
You can't frighten me with your tales, if that's what you're trying to do. My uncle, wants me out of this house for some reason of his own. You're taking this means of getting me out, aren't you? Eh?
You must leave this house,
Yamada said.
Your uncle is coming, but he may not be in time. Listen to me. These creatures, the sea dwellers, envy man, sunlight, and warm fires, and the fields of earth, things which the sea dwellers cannot normally possess. These things, and love. You remember what I said about mind transference, the possession of a brain by an alien intelligence. That is the only way these things can attain that which they desire and know the love of man or woman. Sometimes, not very often, one of these creatures succeeds in possessing itself of a human body. They watch always. When there is a wreck, they go there like vultures to a feast. They can swim phenomenally fast. When a man is drowning, the defenses of his mind are down, and sometimes the sea dwellers can thus acquire a human body. There have been tales of men saved from wrecks who ever after were oddly changed. Morella Godolfo was one of these creatures. The Godolfos knew much of the dark lore, but used it for evil purposes, the so-called black magic. And it was, I think, through this that sea dweller gained power to usurp the brain and body of the woman. A transference took place. The mind of the sea dweller took possession of Morella Godolfo's body, and the intelligence of the original Morella was forced into the terrible form of that creature of the abyss. In time, the human body of the woman died, and the usurping mind returned to its original shell. The intelligence of Morella Godolfo was then ejected from its temporary prison and left homeless. That is true death.
Dean shook his head slowly, as though in denial, but did not speak. And, inexorably, Yamada kept on. For years, generations, since then she has dwelt in the sea, waiting. Her power is strongest here, where she once lived. But, as I told you, only under unusual circumstances can this transference take place. The tenants of this house might be troubled with dreams, but that would be all. The evil being had no power to steal their bodies. Your uncle knew that, or he would have insisted that the place be immediately destroyed. He did not foresee that you would ever live here. The little Japanese bent forward, and his eyes were twin points of black light. You do not need to tell me what you have undergone in the past month. I know. The sea dweller has power over you. For one thing, there are bonds of blood, even though you are not directly descended from her. And your love for the ocean, your uncle spoke of that. You live here alone with your paintings and your imaginative fancies. You see no one else. You are an ideal victim, and it was easy for that sea horror to become in rapport with you. Even now, you show the stigmata.
Dean was silent, his face a pale shadow amidst the darker ones in the corners of the room. What was the man trying to tell him? What were these hints leading up to?
Remember what I have said.
Dr. Yamada's voice was fanatically earnest.
That creature wants you for your youth, your soul. She has lured you in sleep with visions of Poseidonus, the twilight grottos in the deep. She has sent you beguiling visions at first to hide what she was doing. She has drained your life forces, weakened your resistance, waiting until she is strong enough to take possession of your brain. I have told you what she wants, what all these hybrid horrors raven for. She will reveal herself to you in time, and when her will is strong upon you in slumber, you will do her bidding. She will take you down into the deep and show you the kraken-fouled gulfs where these things bide. You will go willingly, and that will be your doom. She may lure you to their feast there, the feast they hold upon the drowned things they find floating from wrecked ships, and you will live such madness in your sleep because she rules you. And then, when you have become weak enough, she will have her desire. The sea thing will usurp your body and walk once more on earth, and you will go down into the darkness where once you dwelt in dreams forever. Unless I am mistaken, you have already seen enough to know that I speak truth. I think that this terrible moment is not so far off, and I warn you that alone you cannot hope to resist the evil. Only with the aid of your uncle and me.
Dr. Yamada stood up. He moved forward and confronted the dazed youth face to face. In a low voice, he asked,
In your dreams, has the thing kissed you?
For a heartbeat, there was utter silence. Dean opened his mouth to speak, and then a curious little warning note seemed to sound in his brain. It rose like the quiet roaring of a conch shell, and a vague nausea assailed him. Almost without volition, he heard himself saying, "No." Dimly, as though from an incredibly far distance, he heard Yamada suck in his breath, as if surprised. Then the Japanese said,
That is good. Very good. Now listen. Your uncle will be here soon. He has chartered a special plane. Will you be my guest until he arrives?
The room seemed to darken before Dean's eyes. The form of the Japanese was receding, dwindling. Through the window, the surf sound came crashing, and it rolled on in waves through Dean's brain. In its thunder, a thin, insistent whispering penetrated.
Accept,
it murmured.
Accept.
And Dean heard his own voice accept Yamada's invitation. He seemed incapable of coherent thought. That last dream haunted him. And now, Dr. Yamada's disturbing story. He was ill. That was it. Very ill. He wanted very much to sleep now. A flood of darkness seemed to wash up and engulf him. Gratefully, he allowed it to sweep through his tired head. Nothing existed but the dark and a restless lapping of unquiet waters. Yet he seemed to know, in an odd way, that he was still, some outer part of him, conscious. He strangely realized that he and Dr. Yamada had left the house, were entering a car, and driving a long way. He was with that strange, external other self, talking casually to the doctor, entering his house in San Pedro, drinking, eating, and all the while his soul, his real being, was buried
in waves of blackness. Finally, a bed. From below, the surf seemed to blend into the blackness that engulfed his brain. It spoke to him now as he rose stealthily and clambered out of the window. The fall jarred his outer self considerably, but he was on the ground outside without injury. He kept in the shadows as he crept away down to the beach. The black, hungry shadows that were like the darkness surging through his soul. Three dreadful hours. With a shock, he was himself once more, completely. The cold water had done it. The water in which he found himself swimming. He was in the ocean, borne on waves as silver as the lightning that occasionally flashed overhead. He heard thunder, felt the sting of rain. Without wondering about the sudden transition, he swam on, as though fully aware of some planned destination. For the first time in over a month, he felt fully alive, actually himself. There was a surge of wild elation in him that defied the facts. He no longer seemed to care about his recent illness, the weird warnings of his uncle and Dr. Yamada, and the unnatural darkness that had previously shadowed his mind. In fact, he no longer had to think. It was as though he were being directed in all his movements. He was swimming parallel with the beach now, and with curious detachment, he observed that the storm had subsided. A pale, fog-like glow hovered over the lashing waters, and it seemed to beckon. The air was chill, as was the water, and the waves high, yet Dean experienced neither cold nor fatigue. And when he saw the things that waited for him on the rocky beach just ahead, he lost all perception of himself in a crescendo of mounting joy. This was inexplicable, for they were the creatures of his last and wildest nightmares. Even now, he did not see them plainly as they sported in the surf, but there were dim suggestions of past horror in their tenebrous outlines. The things were like seals, great, fish-like, bloated monsters with pulpy, shapeless heads. These heads rested on columnar necks that undulated with serpentine ease, and he observed, without any sensation other than curious familiarity, that the heads and bodies of the creatures were a sea-bleached white. Soon he was swimming in among them, swimming with peculiar and disturbing ease. Inwardly he marveled, with a touch of his former feeling, that he was not now horrified by the sea beast in the least. Instead, it was almost with a feeling of kinship that he listened to their strange low gruntings and cackles, listened and understood. He knew what they were saying, and he was not amazed. He was not frightened by what he heard, though the words would have sent abysmal horror through his soul in the previous dreams. He knew where they were going and what they meant to do when the entire group swam out into the water once more. Yet, he did not fear. Instead, he felt a strange hunger at the thought of what was to come, a hunger that impelled him to take the lead as the things with undulant swiftness glided through the inky waters to the north. They swam with incredible speed, yet it was hours before a seacoast loomed up through the murk, lit by a blinding flare of light from offshore. Twilight deepened to true darkness over the water, but the offshore light burned brightly. It seemed to come from a huge wreck in the waves just off the coast, a great hulk floating on the waters like a crumpled beast. There were boats gathered around it, and floating flares of light that revealed the scene. As though by instinct, Dean, with the pack behind him, headed for the spot. Swiftly and silently they sped, their slimy heads blurred in the shadows to which they clung as they circled the boats and swam in toward the great crumpled shape. Now it was looming above him, and he could see arms flailing desperately as man after man sank below the surface. The colossal bulk from which they leaped was a wreck of twisted girders in which he could trace the warped outline of a vaguely familiar shape. And now, with curious disinterest, he swam lazily about, avoiding the lights bobbing over the water as he watched the actions of his companions. They were hunting their prey. Leering muzzles gaped for the drowning men, and lean talons raked bodies from the darkness. Whenever a man was glimpsed in shadows not yet invaded by rescue boats, one of the sea things craftily snared his victim. In a little while, they turned and slowly swam away. But now many of the creatures clutched a grisly trophy at their squamous breast. The pale white limbs of drowning men trailed in the water as they were dragged off into the darkness by their captors. To the accompaniment of low, carrion laughter, the beast swam away, back down the coast. Dean swam with the rest. His mind was again a blur of confusion. He knew what that thing in the water was, and yet he could not name it. He had watched those hateful horrors snare doomed men and drag them off to the deep, yet he had not intervened. What was wrong? Even now, as he swam with frightening agility, he felt a call he could not fully understand, a call that his body was answering. The hybrid things were gradually dispersing. With eerie splashings, they disappeared below the surface of the gelid black waters, pulling with them the dreadfully limp bodies of the men, pulling them down to the blackness biting beneath. They were hungry. Dean knew it without thinking. He swam on, along the coast, impelled by his curious urge. That was it. He was hungry. And now he was going for food. Hours of steady swimming southward. Then the familiar beach, and above it, a lighted house, which Dean recognized. His own house on the cliff. There were figures descending the slope now. 2 men with torches were coming down to the beach. He must not let them see him. Why? He did not know. But they must not. He crawled along the beach, keeping close to the water's edge. Even so, he seemed to move very swiftly. The men with the torches were some distance behind him now. Ahead loomed another familiar outline, a cave. He had clambered over these rocks before, it seemed. He knew the pits of shadow that speckled the cliff rock, and knew the narrow passage of stone through which he now squeezed his prostrate body. Was that someone shouting? Far away? Darkness and a lapping pool. He crawled forward, felt chill waters creep over his body. Muffled by distance came an insistent shouting from outside the cave. Graham! Graham Dean! Then the smell of dank sea foulness was in his nostrils, a familiar, pleasant smell. He knew where he was now. It was the cave where, in his dream, he had kissed the sea thing. It was the cave in which he remembered now. The black blur lifted from his brain, and he remembered all. His mind bridged the gap, and he was once again recalled coming here earlier this very evening, before he had found himself in the water. Morella Godolpho had called him here. Here, her dark whispers had guided him at twilight, when he had come from the bed at Dr. Yamada's house. It was the siren song of the sea creature that had lured him in dreams. He remembered how she had coiled about his feet when he entered, flung her sea-bleached body up until its inhuman head had loomed close to his own, and then the hot, pulpy lips had pressed against his. The loathsome, slimy lips had kissed him again. Wet, dank, horribly avid kiss. His senses had drowned in its evil, for he knew that this second kiss meant doom.
The sea dweller will take your body,
Dr. Yamada had said. And the second kiss meant doom. All this had happened hours ago. Dean shifted around in the rocky chamber to avoid wetting himself in the pool. As he did so, he glanced down at his body for the first time that night. Glanced down with an undulating neck at the shape he had worn for 3 hours in the sea. He saw the fish-like scales, the scabrous whiteness of the slimy skin, saw the veined gills. He stared into the waters of the pool then, so that the reflection of his face was visible in the dim moonlight that filtered through fissures in the rocks. He saw all. His head rested on the long, reptilian neck. It was an anthropoid head with flat contours that were monstrously inhuman. The eyes were white and protuberant. They bulged with the glassy stare of a drowning thing. There was no nose, and the center of the face was covered with a tangle of wormy blue feelers. The mouth was worst of all. Dean saw pale white lips in a dead face, human lips. Lips that had kissed his own, and now they were his own. He was in the body of the evil sea thing. The evil sea thing that had once harbored the soul of Morella Godolpho. At that moment, Dean would gladly have welcomed death, for the stark, blasphemous horror of his discovery was too much to bear. He knew about his dreams now, and the legends. He had learned the truth and paid a hideous price. He recalled vividly how he had recovered consciousness in the water and swum out to meet those others. He recalled the great black hulk from which drowning men had been taken in boats, the shattered wreck on the water. What was it Yamada had told him?
when there is a wreck, they go there like vultures to a feast.
And now, at last, he remembered what had eluded him that night, what that familiar shape on the waters had been. It was a crashed Zeppelin. He had gone swimming into the wreckage with those things, and they had taken men. 3 hours. God! Dean wanted very much to die. He was in the sea body of Morella Godolpho, and it was too evil for further life. Morella Godolpho! Where was she? And his own body. The shape of Graham Dean. A rustling in the shadowy cavern behind him proclaimed the answer. Graham Dean saw himself in the moonlight, saw his body, line for line, hunching furtively past the pool in an attempt to creep away unobserved. Dean's flippered fins moved swiftly. His own body turned. It was ghastly for Dean to see himself reflected where no mirror existed. Ghastlier still to see that in his face there no longer were his eyes. The sly, mocking stare of the sea creature peered out at him from behind their fleshy mask, and they were ancient evil. The pseudo-human snarled at him and tried to dodge off into the darkness. Dean followed on all fours. He knew what he must do. That sea thing, Morella, she had taken his body during that last black kiss, just as he had been forced into hers. But she had not yet recovered enough to go out into the world. That was why he had found her still in the cave. Now, however, she would leave, and his Uncle Michael would never know. The world would never know either what horror stalked its surface until it was too late. Dean, his own tragic form hateful to him now, knew what he must do. Purposefully, he maneuvered the mocking body of himself into a rocky corner. There was a look of fright in those gelid eyes. A sound caused Dean to turn, pivoting his reptilian neck. Through glazed fish eyes, he saw the faces of Michael Lay and Dr. Yamada. Torches in hand, they were entering the cave. Dean knew what they would do, and he no longer cared. He closed in on the human body that housed the soul of the sea beast, closed in with the beast's own flailing flippers, seized it in its own arms and menaced it with its own teeth near the creature's white human neck. From behind him, he heard shouts and cries at his very back, but Dean did not care. He had a duty to perform, an atonement. Through the corner of his eye, he saw the barrel of a revolver as it glinted in Yamada's hand. Then came two bursts of stabbing flame, and the oblivion Dean craved. But he died happy, for he had atoned for the black kiss. Even as he sank into death, Graham Dean had bitten with animal fangs into his own throat, and his heart was filled with peace as, dying, he saw himself die. His soul mingled in the third black kiss of death. It Walks by Night by Henry Kuttner. A blood-chilling narrative of a ghastly horror that stalked through the crypts beneath the old graveyard. Johann leaned heavily against a tall obelisk of discolored marble, his fever-weakened body trembling with exhaustion. The graveyard was a dim black sea, with pale slabs and monoliths standing in irregular ranks all about him. He fumbled with the slide of his lantern, and a white beam sprang out vividly, etching the man's gaunt figure in sharp detail. Deep shadows lay in the hollows of his cheeks and beneath his dilated, smoldering eyes. His face had an angry flush which betrayed the fever blazing in his brain. Fever that had burned away lifelong barriers of fear and driven him to this ancient burying ground where few would have ventured after sundown. For, as all men knew, a horror dwelt among these tombs, an ancient horror that had come down through the generations. There were tales of a thing that walked by night among the graves, so that sometimes when men came searching in broad daylight, they found new graves opened, coffins ruthlessly torn apart, and the bodies gone. Occasionally, one of the villagers would bury his kin in the cemetery at Christian, 20 miles to the north. But this was seldom done, since the horror had dwelt in the graveyard longer than the oldest gray beard, and a kind of hopeless apathy hung like a somber pall over the village. Moreover, there was a tale that, long ago, in the year of the Great Plague, when all bodies were burned for fear of spreading the pestilence, something had come forth from among the tombs and had burst nightly into the houses on the outskirts of the village. A dozen people had vanished without a trace, and, at last, in desperation, the plague-infected corpses had been interred in the old burying ground. Thereafter, the village slept in peace, although now and then a lone traveler or itinerant peddler would disappear, never to be seen again. Still, as the older men whispered among themselves, it was lucky that worse things did not befall. But now, Johann was driven by a fierce urge that made him disregard the ancient menace that lurked among the tombs. He had come for his wife. Elsa, his bride for scarcely a year, had been buried while Johann lay delirious, raving with the same fever that had proved fatal to his wife. Believing him asleep, his cousin's wife had talked too freely, and Johann had learned that Elsa had been interred in the devil-haunted graveyard beyond the outskirts of the village. His beloved Elsa, daughter of the ancient Aubert clan that could trace their fathers back through Thurn and Taxus, the prey of the ghoul. Horror had lent Johann strength to leave his bed and slip unnoticed from his cousin's house, pausing only to snatch his pistol and a lantern. Now he drew the weapon from his shirt as footsteps sounded suddenly nearby. A man came into view in the starlight, gingerly picking his way among the graves. As Johann recognized Carl, his cousin, he thrust the pistol back into his shirt and let the light from his lantern flare out. The newcomer gave a startled cry, quickly muffled. Carl stepped into the wan splotch of light, relief plain in his pale face. "Johann," I thought, "what are you doing here? You can't help Elsa now." Johann looked away abruptly, his mouth working. Carl put a hand on his cousin's shoulder, but Johann shook it off impatiently. "It's your fault, Carl," he accused, his eyes dark with anger. "You let them bury Elsa here, in this devil-ridden place." Carl made a placating gesture. "What could I do? I told them you would not." "I know,"
The resentment was gone from Johann's voice. It was very bitter now.
Our heads have been bowed beneath the yoke for a long time. Too long, Carl. Elsa shall not. She has been buried a week now. You have no shovel.
It was true. Johann had had no time to procure one during his flight. He said slowly,
I can guard her grave. At any rate, you can go back to the village and get shovels.
Carl was silent. After a moment, Johann laughed mirthlessly.
Bring the shovels tomorrow then, he jeered.
You won't be afraid to come here in daylight. Stung, Carl responded.
It's not daylight now. Come home, Johann. We can get Elsa tomorrow. One more night won't. It's dangerous, Johann. They say it's been walking again.
Johann shrugged with a nonchalance he did not feel. He was shivering in the chill wind that blew over the neglected graves. His fears, forgotten in his delirium, were slowly creeping back to torment him, but he pushed them resolutely aside.
I'm not afraid, he growled,
and moved forward among the graves, his lantern sending out a beam of yellow light that rested on lichen-stained stone and the worm-eaten and weathered surface of wooden slabs and crosses. Once he tripped over a fallen tombstone, half buried in the ground, and would have fallen had not Carl caught him. Carl began a frantic protest which his cousin did not hear. Johann was staring intently into the gloom. He took a few hasty steps, and at his feet loomed the black gulf of an open grave. He sent the beam of the lantern darting down into it and saw that the coffin lid was broken and shattered, and that the sarcophagus itself was empty. Even before the light searched out the inscription upon the wooden slab at the head of the violated grave, he knew what would be painted there. Beside him, Carl caught his breath in a gasp of fear, but Johann merely stood silent, swaying a little, the dank wind blowing coldly across his wet face, and his thoughts were a chaotic swirl in which horror and grief and anger were mingled. Out of his poignant grief and his horror, fierce anger racked his feverish brain with surges of red rage that shook him with their intensity. Under his shirt, he felt the bulk of the pistol, and he gripped it fiercely. Elsa! Her slim white body, the prey of the ghoul! Suddenly, all Johann's fear was forgotten in his blinding, overwhelming anger. Carl was tugging at his arm. He turned to meet his cousin's frightened gaze. Johann, what are you waiting for? We can't stay here. It has walked again. No, Johann barked out the word fiercely, his eyes blazing. Elsa! It's too late, Johann. Elsa is gone. Is it too late for vengeance? Johann asked quietly, and at his words, Carl shrank back, stark amazement in his face. Vengeance? He whispered the word fearfully, and a shudder racked him. He shot an apprehensive glance into the dimness about them. Then he said, still whispering, You are mad, Johann. Deliberately, Johann drew out his pistol.
Very well, I am mad. But, Carl, if it were your wife...
He broke off, his lips twitching, and when he resumed, his voice was chill, with inflexible purpose.
Listen to me, Carl. I'm going to make someone, God, man, or devil, suffer for this crime.
He glanced at the black gulf of the violated grave.
So go home, Carl. You can't help me now.
Carl opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. His eyes flashed past Johann's shoulder, and into them sprang a look of panic fear. With a strangled scream, he spun about and went racing off, his footsteps disquietingly loud in the chill, empty silence. Johann turned quickly. At first, he saw nothing in the dim starlight. Then, far away, he saw a faint movement among the tombs. There was a flicker of motion in the distance, where an ancient mausoleum stood all alone on the side of a little hillock. He waited, scarcely breathing, for a time, but there was no further movement at the distant tomb. Carl's footsteps had died away, and there was not a sound to be heard. Johann fingered the pistol irresolutely. Then he thrust it back in his shirt and hurriedly made his way among the graves to where the mausoleum stood on the knoll, pale and ominous in the starlight. The tomb was incredibly ancient and weathered, overgrown with a thick coating of lichen that draped it like gray spiderwebs. There was an inscription above the door, but save for the single word, Maranatha, it was illegible. Johann did not pause to examine it after he saw that the great stone portal was open. With cold rage surging within him, he stepped over the threshold and sent the light darting about the tomb. It was empty. Bare granite walls met his gaze, but there was a door of rusted metal set in the further wall, and this was ajar. Johann squeezed through the gap and held the lantern high. He was in an empty passage, paved with great stone slabs sloping down into the side of the little hill. A faint whispering sound, like the slithering of water over jagged rocks, was audible, and Johann cautiously advanced. The passage turned and twisted in the rock, but it continued to descend steeply, and twice Johann passed the black miles of side tunnels. Now the faint whispering was louder. He recognized the sound of voices, but there was a curious squeaking and snarling that puzzled him. A sound such as might originate in a nest of rats. The cold tide of sanity was slowly rising in Johann's brain, and misgivings were beginning to assail him. But the thought of Elsa's looted grave enabled him to force them out of his mind. He replaced the slide on the lantern and moved forward in utter darkness, feeling his way and straining to distinguish an intelligible word from the babble of chatterings and whisperings that he heard. Slowly he advanced, sliding his hand along the wall and
Suddenly a voice sounded distinct and clear above the sly mutterings. It was harsh and grating, possessing a curious quality of depth, as though it came from far underground, and it said distinctly,
"Has been going long."
A wave of fear came rushing up to overwhelm Johann, and he clung desperately to the thought of Elsa and his vengeance. Fighting back his horror, he edged forward, and as though at a signal, a sudden silence fell. Johann caught a whisper.
"We'll be back to bring us food."
Behind him, there was a rustling, swiftly growing louder. In the blackness, nothing was visible, but Johann flung himself flat against the wall. The rustling swept past him, and for a moment, an overpowering stench filled his nostrils. He was conscious that something had passed close to him, something he could not see for the darkness. Although he felt sick and giddy with its passing, he leaned against the wall, grateful for its support, and the whisperings and shrillings broke out afresh, this time with an eerie note of disappointment. A new voice spoke, a quiet, emotionless voice with a dreadful feline purr in it.
"No food could I find, my ancestors. No food or drink. Must we go hungry?"
Another voice whined, and a plaintive series of cries burst from the grim darkness that pulsed with unseen, horrific life.
"You must feed us. It is your duty. We are unable."
A deeper voice spoke.
"You must fulfill your trust. Each of us fed our ancestors who could not feed themselves, and it is your duty to find us food. When in time you, too, become like us, unable to go forth to search after new graves, you will expect the next heir to fulfill his duty. I found food for you 2 nights ago."
The other voice purred, and Johann caught his breath and shuddered in the shielding darkness.
"It is your trust and your privilege,"
the deep voice cut in, brittle and harsh.
"This is the curse and the blessing of our blood that knows no other life after death." "But there are so many,"
cried the other, and a stifled gasp of fear came from Johann's stiff lips. A taut silence fell, and the man turned to ice. Past him went a soft rustling, almost brushing his numb body, swiftly dying away. Then there was no sound, only the charnel darkness that pressed silently upon him, and behind him he heard a heavy thud. Stung into life, Johann spun about and, in an agony of fear, went racing back through the twisted corridor, back to the open air and the clean starlight. He felt a heavy blow on his chest and staggered back, almost falling, the lantern slipping from his grasp and thudding to the ground. As he tottered there in the blackness, he heard the abominable rustling go past him again and fade into silence. Gasping, uttering little moans, he fell on his hands and knees and groped frantically for the lantern. For a moment, it eluded his clutching fingers, and Johann felt the skin
of his back crawling with the expectation of an attack. Then with a sob of relief, he found the lantern and snatched off the slide, praying that it had not gone out. It had not. A yellow beam of light pitilessly illuminated the thing that had halted Johann's flight. The great door in the tomb. The door by which he had entered this Cimmerian cave of night and horror. But now it was no longer ajar. He realized what had happened. The rustling that had passed him. The heavy thud. The creature, Johann dared not give it a name, had slipped past him and closed the door to prevent his escape. Breathing heavily, Johann put down the lantern and examined the door. There were no handles or knobs. It was a bare, rivet-studded plate of rusty metal. He braced his shoulder against it and strained until his head swam, but he could not move the door. Again, swift anger mounted within him, and the thought of Elsa supplied the spark to the tinderbox of his fury. With rage and fear battling within him, he drew out his pistol, examined it to see if the moisture of the vault had damped the charge, and slowly began to retrace his steps. He paused occasionally to flash the light behind him, but nothing lurked at his heels. Nothing but the black tunnel mouths that seemed to watch him ominously. And presently he saw that he was on the threshold of an archway that led into silent, unstirring darkness. Twice Johann went forward, and twice he retreated in fear. At last he raised the pistol and stepped over the threshold, swiftly flashing the light about the great vault in which he stood. For a moment he thought he was confronting an array of mummies, withered and dry. They were lying against the walls in grotesque postures. A dozen brown, wrinkled bodies, some of them merely skeletons with wrinkled, dark skin stretched over their bones. The floor was buried beneath a carpet of bones, ranging in color from crumbled black to shining white bones, on which the marks of gnawing were dreadfully evident. At Johann's feet, a skull grinned up at him in a grim mockery of mirth. As the light gleamed through the tomb, a frightful rustling and a stir went over the withered bodies. There was a monstrous shifting and squirming, and Johann saw moving what should never move, what should always lie silent and still and dead under the coffin lid. The things crawled about like maggots, blindly creeping away from the light. And Johann still stood there, the lantern in one hand and his pistol in the other, without moving a muscle or turning his eyes from the charnel horror before him. The light gleamed on, cold, shiny eyes staring at him speculatively. Behind him came the rustling, and Johann swung about, his light stabbing out through the blackness. Far down the passage, a vague figure was moving toward him, slowly, implacably. Behind him came an outburst of abominable squeakings and whistlings. Johann jerked up his pistol, the thought of Elsa steadying his hand. He would wait until the thing was almost upon him, and then. But his fear betrayed him. The crash of the explosion sent sharp echoes rolling through the vault.
The dreadful form did not pause. It glided onward, silently save for the faint rustling of garments. And Johann took a step back. Something clutched at his ankle, and in a frenzy of fear, he kicked free. For a second, he had turned his back on the half-seen figure that was inexorably drawing nearer, and when he swung about, it was almost upon him. There was no time to reload the pistol. Johann flung up his arm as though the lantern had been a weapon. Two things happened almost simultaneously. A purring, gloating voice came from the dim form, and it said triumphantly,
"We shall not go hungry."
And the light revealed the face of the approaching horror, and Johann dropped the lantern and began to scream over and over.
"Elsa! Elsa!"
Thank you for listening.
Have a great night.